Hello everybody, I am the Friendly Englishman. Thank you so much for joining me here on my small channel. This is part 4 of Seer by C.L. Werner. But just quickly before we dive back into the story, if you are watching this, then please help me out by subscribing to the channel or clicking the like button. Clicking the like button helps me out way more than you would think. It really promotes the video up in the algorithm and helps me reach more viewers and generate more revenue. So that's enough hawking my wares, let's dive on in. Chapter 3: Worms and Rats. The hideout, as Hans Dietrich called it, was nothing more than a disused cellar beneath the Orc and Axe. The little gang paid Allgrin Shatterhand, the proprietor of the tavern, a tidy sum to keep the cellar that way. There was a hidden door in the small foyer between bar and kitchen that allowed the smugglers entry to their secret storehouse. It was a vital element of their operation to have a safe place to store merchandise when immediate delivery proved impractical. The Orc and Axe, infamous as one of the most violent dens of vice and drunkenness on all the waterfront, made a perfect disguise for their activities. The place was so notorious there wasn't a watchman in all Altdorf who would look beneath the surface for more crime. The panderers, weird root addicts, river pirates, mobsmen, thieves and murderers who patronized the tavern's taproom were more than enough to meet any thief-taker's quota. If there was one thing that had impressed itself upon Hans over the years, it was the fact that the only person stupider and lazier than a watchman was the common outlaw. Staying out of Munson Keep or Reichsfang prison wasn't a question of being a genius, only a matter of being cleverer than the next thief and keeping quiet when he took the fall. It was a philosophy that had kept Hans clean so far as the magistrates were concerned. Despite over a decade of larceny, his brother, Johann, had violated the precept of not meddling in somebody else's fight. He'd been tossed into the Reichsfang for 3 years after getting caught up in the window tax riots. Perhaps it would have been better had he spent a few more years in the dungeons of the Reichsfang. The extra time might have knocked a bit more sense into Johann's thick skull. As it was, the younger Dietrich still had disturbing displays of idealism from time to time. At least he was a dependable lieutenant, a vital asset when the gang included slippery weasels like Kempf among their numbers. Watching the diminished gang move through the narrow, garbage-ridden back alleys of the waterfront, Hans realized he'd need to recruit some new muscle, sooner rather than later, with Gustav Volk on the prowl for them. Hans slipped in the side door of the tavern after making sure no one was about. He was always cautious about government informants and watchmen keeping a low profile, and tonight he was doubly so. If what they found in the sewers really was what Kempf claimed it to be, they'd make back what they had lost with the wine and then some. He held the rickety door, nothing more than a few planks fitted to a hinge, as the rest of his gang shuffled out of the shadows and darted inside. Johann brought up the rear, his dagger drawn, following close behind Kleiner as the big man shuffled his way down the alley, his arms wrapped about the strange stone. Even with an oilskin draped over it, the rock gave off a faint green glow in the darkness. Hans wrinkled his nose. The last thing they needed was somebody spotting that and getting the witch hunters involved. The rumble of voices and bawdy songs from the tavern's main room covered the entrance of the smugglers. The only one watching the side door was Greta, a plain-faced serving wench with a body like an oversexed cow. She had a thing for one of the gang and always hung around the door when she could watch their comings and goings. "Evening, Greta," Hans said as he slipped inside. The girl grinned at him, then craned her head, looking slightly disappointed that only Kleiner and Johann were still outside. "Is Krebs not with you?" she asked, a dejected note in her voice. Sorry, love. The dock watch nabbed him. You won't see him until they let him out of Munzen Keep, Hans lied. Johann gave his brother a sour look. They had both seen Krebs spitted like a fish on Gustav Volk's sword. The only way Greta would see him again was with the help of a necromancer. He was just a bit too slow tonight, Hans continued, returning his brother's sour look. There was no sense telling the girl the truth and spending half the night trying to console a bawling female. Nobody's fault, really. Sometimes the blasted griffins get lucky is all. Greta's eyes were starting to turn red and damp, a flush rising in her plump face. Hans patted her shoulder. Don't fret none, Poppet, he told her. Me and the lads will see the bribe gets doled out. He'll be back knocking at your window in no time. Hans didn't have the time to wipe the smile off his face before Johann was pushing him into the pantry and down the steps to the hidden cellar. Anyone ever tell you that you're a worm? Johann growled. You think telling her that her darling swain is a notch on Volk's sword would make her feel any better? Hans retorted. I have to say, brother, sometimes I think dear old mum did our father wrong when you get all stupid on me. Hans descended into the cellar. It was a rude, dilapidated affair. Plaster walls bulging with the Altdorf damp, a timber ceiling that creaked every time anyone headed out the tavern's back entrance to use the privy, and spiderwebs so thick they could choke an ogre. Still, what it lacked in the niceties, it made up for in discretion. A smuggler had to choose inconspicuous over luxury every time. The rest of the depleted gang was clustered around the only lantern in the place, a glass-faced storm lantern they'd somehow acquired from the ship of a Morarienburg trader. The glass was cracked, throwing weird shadows across the floor, but at least it was better than sitting in the dark and far less stifling than a smoke-belching torch. Hans did another quick head count. Müller, Kleiner, the Rat Kempf, Wilhelm and Johann. No doubt about it, but Volk's little ambush had cost them a lot of manpower. You can set that thing down now, Hans told Kleiner. The big oaf was still holding the glowing rock against his chest, even with sweat dripping down his forehead and veins bulging from the sides of his neck. He let the rock crash to the floor and crumpled into a gasping wreck. The other smugglers cursed at the loud noise and instantly trained their eyes on the ceiling, trying to decide if they had been heard. Hans shook his head. With all the racket rising from the tap room, they could be murdering the Emperor's mistress down here and nobody would hear it. He smacked his hands together to draw the men's attention back to him. Well, boys, we had a bad night of it, Hans said. Bad night, Wilhelm snarled. He waved his bandaged hand at the gang thief. They cut off 2 of my fingers. Next time, you'll get out of the way, Hans quipped. Johann stepped beside his brother, a menacing reminder to Wilhelm that he would get much worse than a few missing fingers if he started anything. Cain's black hells, Hans, cursed Kempf. That wasn't the dock watch or sewer jacks that rumbled onto us. That was Gustav Volk. In case you forgot, he works for Klast. Those people don't throw you into Munzen Keep, they bury you under it. And they don't never stop looking for you either, Wilhelm added. Never. Hans shook his head. So you'd prefer that we were working for Volk all this time? Funny, I don't remember anybody complaining about splitting the 40% that Leech would have taken off every job. Yeah, well now's different, Kemp spat. Now Volk's onto us. So what do you want to do? Everybody wants to quit and bottle out because the big bad Volk is after them. Hans was a bit annoyed by all the nodding heads that greeted the suggestion. We've enough stashed from the last few jobs to get good and far from Altdorf, Müller told him. I'm thinking Vertbad might be far enough to stay out of Volk's grasp. If it's just Volk, Johann interrupted. If it's his boss looking for you, Kislev isn't far enough away. His brother's sobering remark brought a decidedly depressing chill to the air, like a schoolroom bully letting out the air from a pig's bladder. Hans decided to play the card he had been holding back. He fished in his tunic and pulled out a sack of coins. With a flourish, he threw the bag onto the floor, making sure everyone could hear the clatter of metal against metal. There's all the swag from the last 3 jobs, Hans said, smiling as the men pounced on the bag. Divide it up any way you like, and may Ranald's favour go with you. Hans paused, letting a sly twinkle into his eye. Of course, if you leave now, you don't get a share. That remark made some heads turn, suspicious eyes fixed on Hans. Share in what? Müller demanded. Hans patted the oilskin-draped stone, letting his fingers tap against its sides, letting the drumming noise echo across the cellar. If this is Weirdstone, Kempf, how much would it be worth? You wouldn't cut us out of that, Kemp snarled, more than ever resembling some cornered rodent. But you men all want to leave Altdorf, Hans said. Those who stay behind to sell this commodity should reap the rewards. What have we always said? An equal share of the risk, an equal share of the swag. That simple rule has kept us honest so far. I see no reason why it shouldn't still apply. The men looked at Hans as if he'd just spat in their beer. Kleiner rose from the floor, looking for a moment as if he'd like to rip the sneering rogue limb from limb. Wilhelm fingered his knife, a gruesome thing that looked like it was made for gutting sharks. Müller just stood and glared. Kempf muttered to himself, chewing on his moustache. How much do you say it would be worth? Johann asked, backing his brother's play. Kempf glared at both of the Dietrichs. If, and I say if, the thing really is Weirdstone, there's no saying how much it's worth. How do we see if it is Weirdstone? Hans asked. Kempf looked like he had just swallowed something bitter. I know people, he began. Who? Prodded Johann. It would be like the little weasel to keep everything to himself and leave the rest of them hanging out in the wind if he got the chance. Even Kleiner wasn't stupid enough to let Kempf do anything secret. I could take it to Dr. Lowe, the alchemist, Kempf said after a moment. He'd know. Hans nodded. A good plan, he agreed. Then he drew his dagger. Before any of the other smugglers could react, Hans smashed the edge of his blade against the brittle rock, knocking an inch-long sliver from its side. But what if we don't take the whole stone to him? I think that would be safer, don't you? We wouldn't like your Dr. Lowe to get any queer ideas about stealing the whole thing from us. We take him a little piece and maybe we can keep him honest. What about the rest of it? Asked Müller. Hans looked around the small cellar for a moment, looking for a place that could hide the bulky rock and its unnatural glow. His gaze finally settled on an old wine cask that had been in the cellar before the building above was even called the Orc and Axe. It had been cheap to begin with, and over the years it had soured itself into pungent vinegar. Hans pointed to the barrel and all the smugglers smiled at the suggestion. The tap room of the Orc and Axe was filled almost to bursting by the time the smugglers emerged from their hasty conference. It was just the way Johann preferred it. Crowded, the sudden arrival of the smugglers would pass largely unnoticed. More tactically minded than his brother, Johann was a good deal more cautious than Hans about the secrecy of their lair. Hans, in his opinion, trusted to luck and the favour of Ranald the trickster too much and too often. The eyes of the dock watch weren't just on the streets, and now there were Gustav Volk's spies to worry about as well. Johann's steely gaze swept across the tap room, studying the motley gutter sweepings sitting about the tavern's dilapidated tables and gathered about its knife-scarred bar. Grimy, sour-faced visages sometimes looked up from their tankards of beer and flagons of ale to return his challenging inspection. Waterfront stevedores, back-alley swindlers, leather-faced fishermen, squinty thieves, swaggering sailors, brutish muggers, and foppish panderers all clustered about the cheap booze and scarcely edible fare of Algren Shatterhand's establishment. Johann could see the gaudy fabrics of Marienburg, heavy fur cloaks from Kislev, the striped homespun of Nuln and Wissenland, the threadbare greens of Vertbad, even the balloon-like cut of Tillian tunics and trousers. The smuggler laughed grimly. It wasn't in the lofty spires of government and aristocracy where men from foreign places and foreign minds came together as equals with common purpose. It was in the lowest rungs of society that men set aside their differences. It was in the gutter that they came together. Any one of those faces that looked back at him might be one of Volk's spies. Johann shook his head. The organization Vesper class had put together had its fingers in every district in Altdorf. Even if none of Volk's people were in the crowd, some of Clast's were certain to be. Hans was really tasting the limits of Renald's divine indulgence. It was Johann's experience that the gods seldom favoured fools over long. Hans and the others had already sidled over to the bar, pushing a knot of grumbling stevedores to make room for them. The labourers looked ready to make trouble, but proved too sober to pick a fight with any mob that included someone like Kleiner among its numbers. Hans was barking out orders for Reichland Hock when Johann joined them. "This is stupid, Hans," Johann hissed from the corner of his mouth. "Somebody is sure to be looking for us." "They won't start anything here," Hans protested. He smiled as he took the clay tankards from the dumpy woman behind the counter. He pushed drinks down the bar to his men. He rolled his eyes when Johann refused the last tankard. "You worry too much," Hans grumbled, pointedly taking a swig from the tankard he had offered to his brother. "Comes from all that thinking you're doing all the time. A man can't think his way out of whatever the gods have in store for him." "It damn sure can't hurt," Johann retorted. "You ever stop to think Volk is sure to hear about us being here?" Hans sighed, looking back down the bar. His annoyance grew when he saw that the rest of his men were watching the two brothers with rapt attention. Wilhelm wasn't even drinking, instead soaking his mangled hand in the tankard. Kempf had a slithery look in his expression, and his frequent glances in the direction of the pantry and the cellar beneath it told quite clearly where his faults were. Kleiner was scratching at his arm between trying to stifle a sudden persistent cough. Old Müller just looked resigned, like a beetle waiting for the other boot to fall. Hans leaned into his brother, keeping his voice low, but not so low that the other smugglers couldn't hear him. "I want Volk to know about this place. If his people are watching it, then there's small chance one of us is going to come sneaking back here on his own and try to make off with the Weirdstone. It'll take all of us to even have a chance of getting something that big out of here." Kempf hissed something unrepeatable. Wilhelm slammed his hurt hand against the counter and took a drink from his tankard. Kleiner coughed. Müller just gave voice to a pained groan. Hans grinned like the face of Cain, enjoying his brother's look of disbelieving horror. "That's right," he said. "I'd rather put all of us on the spot than have somebody getting rich off my sweat." Johann decided not to point out that it had been mostly Kleiner's sweat, any more than he was minded to observe that their chances of making off with the Weirdstone even together weren't going to be good. Volk's gang was sure to get some of them. He felt disgusted as he saw the answer reflected in his brother's twinkling eyes. That was part of the plan. Fewer shares to go around. Not stupid, just callously reckless and ruthless. Disgusted, Johann looked away from Hans, staring instead at the massive axe fastened to the wall above the bar. It was a huge weapon, the runes and craftsmanship proclaiming its dwarvish origin. It was a testament to how much the tavern's proprietor was feared and respected on the waterfront, that no one had seen fit to try and steal it. Allgrin Shatterhand was known for his black tempers and a sadistic streak seldom found in a dwarf. Some said the loss of his hand had made him mean enough to choke a giant with the other ones. Others said it was some secret shame that made him an exile from his own people, which had made him as bitter as the waters of the Sour Sea. Johann had heard a slightly different version from the few dwarves he'd met in the Orcan Axe. They said Allgrin's Shutterhand was such a miserable grumbaki because of that stender above the axe bar. A cheap human-crafted forgery if they'd ever seen one. Thinking about the axe made Johann look down the other end of the counter where an enormous glass jar rested. If the axe was a forgery, there was nothing fake about the tavern's other mascot. Pickled and preserved, the jar was filled with the swollen, snarling head of the largest, nastiest orc anyone in Altdorf had ever seen. Many fights in the tavern started as arguments about whether the thing had really belonged to a large orc or had instead come from a small troll. Whatever the case, it was generally agreed that Allgrin had lost his hand to orcs before he settled down to establish his taverns. The standing offer of free drinks to anyone who brought a larger orc head to the dwarf only helped to support such rumours. As Johann looked at the leathery, green-skinned scowl of the head, his eyes were drawn to movement beyond the trophy. The bat-wing doors at the front of the tavern swung open, admitting a knot of armed men. Instantly, the murmur of conversation in the tap room faded away to a whisper of muttered curses and hastily concealed contraband. The foremost of the men was nearly as tall as Johann, with much broader shoulders. His features were regular, almost aristocratic, if they hadn't been spoiled by a jagged knife scar along their left cheek, pulling the corner of the man's mouth into a slight pucker. Dark eyes, like the dark pits of Munzen Keep, fixed Johann with their gaze, then quickly looked past him and focused on his brother. The scarred mouth did its best to spread into a smile. The man dropped his hand casually to the longsword he wore at his side, the leather of his glove creaking as his fingers assumed a deceptively easy grip on the pommel. "I've paid!" The outburst came from behind the counter. A hinged section of the bar swept upward, and the stocky figure of Allgrin Shatterhand stormed out. The dwarf's long white beard was tucked into the belt of his beer-stained apron, his grubby hand wiping foam across his leather leggings. The steel hook that gleamed from the stump of his other hand was held menacingly at his side. "You can't go abusing my custom, Griffin. I've paid." And the man with the scar turned a withering scowl against the dwarf. Funny, the captain must have failed to mention it. He made a gesture with his hand, tapping the bronze pectoral that hung above his halberd of reinforced leather. A griffin rampant, a halberd clenched in its talons, stood out upon the flat metal plate. It was the same figure that was represented upon the white armbands each of the armed men wore. It was the symbol of the Altdorf City Watch. The bronze pectoral denoted the speaker was a sergeant in that stalwart organization. "He'll damn sure to mention it after I get through talking to him," Allgrin snarled. "And then he'll take that fancy jewelry away from you and kick your arse back down the sewer jacks." The sergeant fixed Allgrin with his most authoritarian stare. "He'll be happy to hear you are so vocal about the bribe he accepts, Drock," the soldier said. "It might make him reconsider the arrangement." The words had their intended effect. Sputtering and cursing, Allgrin Shatterhand retreated back behind the counter, leaving his patrons to the attentions of Theodore Bear and his watchman. It wasn't a general raid for outlaws and contraband that interested the sergeant tonight, however. There was a very specific purpose behind his visit, and as he turned his attention away from the angry dwarf and back to the men clustered around the bar, he found himself looking at that reason. Nodding to his men, Theodore Bear strolled over to where Hans Dietrich was trying his best to look inconspicuous. "Heard you had some trouble tonight," Theodore said by way of greeting. "Get stuffed, Griffin," Hans spat. "No thanks," Theodore replied, pushing the tankard away from Hans's fingers, forcing the man to turn around and face him. "Though I think Gustav Volk has some idea about doing something of the sort to you." "Volk is always talking tough," Johann interrupted, "but we're still here." Theodore looked down the bar, letting his eyes rest a while on each man. His gaze lingered on Kleiner, watching as the man almost doubled over from a fit of coughing. "Seems to me there's a lot less of you here than a few nights ago." "I think some of the boys might have caught a ship for some place," Hans said. "If they caught a ship, its port of call was the Gardens of Moor," Theodore retorted. He raised the tankard, sniffed at it and wrinkled his nose at the reek of the cheap beer. "Though I can't blame them for keeping away if this is the best stuff you can get here." "Whatever you are fishing for, Griffin, you won't find it here," Johann said, glowering at the sergeant. Theodore shook his head. "I'm not interested in you lot," he said, though once again his attention was distracted by Kleiner's coughing and scratching. "You're small fish. I want the big shark. I want Volk." "I'd like to give him to you," Hans smiled, "but unfortunately that is a commodity that isn't mine to sell." The elder Dietrich threw down several silver coins onto the bar and shuffled away from the counter. The rest of the smugglers followed him, Kleiner last of all. Theodore watched them leave, but made no move to stop them. In the doorway, as the small band left the Orcan axe, Johann looked back at the sergeant. Theodore wasn't watching the smugglers anymore. Johann saw him further down the bar, near where Kleiner had been standing. Across the distance, Johann couldn't see what Theodore found so interesting. He didn't see the strange, fat green worm writhing on the counter as it burrowed its way into the woodwork. The chamber of the Council of 13 was deep within the shattered tower, an ancient structure older than even the Skaven race. The shattered tower loomed above the decaying sprawl of Skaven blight like the warning finger of a malevolent god. Even with its foundations sucked down into the mire of the blighted marshes, there was no corner of Skaven blight upon which its shadow did not fall. It was a potent reminder of the authority and reach of the Lords of Decay, a physical tribute to the awful power of the Horned Rat and his domination of his chosen people, the Skaven. Enormous doors, carved from black Southland wood and engraved with the sinister sign of the Horned Rat, guarded the entrance to the council chamber. Before the black doors, the biggest rat ogre Thanquol had ever seen crouched beside the wall, the chain fixing its collar to the thick iron staples set into the floor, looking to have been stolen from a warship's anchor. The ugly brute rose up as it caught the scent of Thanquol and his escorts. Nearly furless, every inch of the rat ogre's exposed hide had been branded with the mark of the Horned Rat. It snuffled grotesquely at the air, like some great hound, then slowly lurched away from its post beside the doorway. Thanquol controlled a quiver of fear as he felt the flagstones beneath his paws tremble from the huge monster's plodding steps. The albino storm vermin who flanked him, the guards who had led him through the streets of Skavenblight to ensure he kept his meeting with the council, gave the faintest hint of musk as the brute's muscular bulk thundered past. Thanquol did not find the subdued fear of his grim escorts comforting. He wondered how many of those summoned to the chambers of the council ended up in the monster's claws. The rat ogre's immense paw closed around an enormous club with a head of grotesquely carved warpstone. To Thanquol's awed gaze, it looked as if the brute held an entire tree in its claws. He could imagine the weapons smashing down, pulverizing whatever it struck into a gooey smear on the floor. The Grey Seer took a few nervous steps back, ensuring at least a few of the storm vermin were closer to the beast than he was. The Rat Ogre, however, seemed to take no further notice of Thanquol and his entourage. Turning, the brute ambled over to a gigantic brass gong. With one swift motion, the monster brought his club smashing into the suspended metal disc, the violence of the impact sending a puff of green dust rising from the warpstone head. A sound, low and sinister and evil, droned through the black corridors of the shattered tower, vibrating through the stones with malefic purpose. Thanquol could feel the sound pulse through his bones and ground his fangs against a terrifying sensation. The single throbbing note faded away, seeming to devour its own echoes. As it passed into nothingness, a new sound scratched at Thanquol's senses. Slowly, with eerie precision, the great doors of the Chamber of 13 were swinging open. Moved by some force even Thanquol's sorcerer's gaze could not discern. Smells, both ancient and evil, billowed out from the room beyond the doors. Thanquol fought to keep his heart from racing. There would be time enough for terror after he crossed the threshold. White paws closed about the Grey Seer's shoulders, giving him an encouraging shove towards the doorway when he hesitated. Thanquol scowled at the mute armoured ratmen. Obviously, the cowardly wretched had no intention of accompanying him further. He wished the shrivelling of their rat hoods and 1,000 other curses upon them as he carefully crept across the threshold, watching every step with a caution that made his experience in the maze of merciless penance seem overbold. No sooner had Thanquol stepped inside the chamber than the great black doors slammed shut behind him with a resounding boom. The Grey Seer sprang forward 10 feet, his pulse racing. Anxious paws flew to his long, hairless tail, stroking it like a broodmother with her favourite whelp. Thanquol let out a long gasp of relief. It was all there. Somehow his tail had managed to avoid being caught in the slamming doors. A low, bubbling chuckle took Thanquol's thoughts from his near escape to the greater peril that still menaced him. It was a deep, throaty laugh, sickening and rotten. Thanquol was reminded of gas escaping from beneath a bog. It was a cruel, savage sort of humour that brooked no goodwill towards whatever it was directed against. He knew such a voice could belong to only one creature, Arch-Plague Lord Nurglich, the foul master of the disgusting plague monks of Clan Pestilence. The Grey Seer peered across the chamber. It was a great, round hall, its ceiling lost in the darkness far above. Braziers of glowing warpstone cast flickering shadows across the room, somehow managing to further obscure the far end of the hall even as they illuminated the centre. Even Thanquol's keen gaze could scarcely make out the other side of the chamber. He had the impression of a rounded dais and a circular podium draped in red cloth. Behind the podium were chairs, but whatever sat upon them was nothing more than an indistinct shape, a blotch of blackness that might hide anything or nothing. Thanquol did not need to count the chairs to know that there were 13. Their occupants, if any, would be the Lords of Decay, the warlords and masters of the most powerful clans in the Under Empire. He could barely make out the banners that stood behind each chair, casting a darker shadow upon its occupant. Each banner depicted the sign of the great clan or warlord clan the Lord of Decay ruled over and represented. The assassins of Clan Eshin, the fanatics of Clan Pestilence, the brutal warriors of Clan Moors and Clan Scab, all had their representative upon the Council of 13. 2 of the seats bore no banner, however. Instead, there was a metal icon, the crooked crossbars that represented the horned rat. One of the seats would be occupied by the Seer Lord, the voice of the Skaven god and his chosen prophet. The other stood above the centermost seat, a seat that was always kept vacant, kept waiting for the presence of the horned rat himself. The Seer Lord would interpret the will of the horned rat whenever the council was called upon to vote upon some matter of policy. In effect, the tradition gave the Seer Lord a double vote, but no Skaven was bold enough to challenge the connection between Kritislik and their merciless god. "Grey Seer Thankwall," a growling voice echoed from the shadowy podium. Some trick of acoustics made it impossible to pinpoint from which seat the voice emanated, magnifying and distorting it beyond any semblance of mortal speech. Thankwall tried to identify the voice, unable to decide if it belonged to General Paskrit or Warlord Nordwell. "The stink of fear is in your fur." Thankwall lowered his head and exposed his throat in abasement, trying to leave no question about his humility before the forbidding masters of his race. The warpstone braziers made it impossible for him to catch the scent of the seated warlords, but clearly the same disadvantage was not shared by the rat men upon the dais. "Only a fool does not cower grovel before the magnificent terror of the council, O mighty tyrant," said Thankwall. Scratchy laughter chittered from the darkness. "Save your flattery and your lies for those witless enough to listen, mouse-bellied offal." A knife-thin voice, possibly that of Night Lord Sneak, snickered. "Come forward, wretched one." The voice of Nurglich, stagnant and slobbering, oozed from the shadows. Thankwall's glands clenched. "Stand where the council can see you." Thankwall quivered. Even the trickery of the chamber could not disguise that voice. Nurglich, the decayed master of Clan Pestilence and its plague priests. One of Thankwall's earliest successes had been at the expense of the plague priests, orchestrating the assassination of Plague Lord Scratsquick before the disease-worshipping ratmen could finish his improved strain of yellow pox. Nurglich had been forced to decry Scratsquick as a renegade after the fact to save his face with his fellow Lords of Decay, but it was convenience more than belief that moved his fellow Skaven to accept the story. The bloated old plague rat was not one to forget any slight against his clan. "Come forward," the command came again, this time from a voice fairly creaking with age and brittle with wickedness. Thankwall had no difficulty identifying his own master, the Seer Lord Kritislik. "The council does not ask twice," Kritislik added with both menace and irony. Thankwall forced himself upright and timidly approached the dais. His heart was hammering in his chest now. Only a supreme effort kept his scent glands clenched. What game was Kritislik playing with him? Had the Seer Lord released him from the maze simply to destroy him before the entire council? It was just the sort of grandiose display that would appeal to Kritislik. The horrible thought came to him. Maybe the Seer Lord was looking to earn some goodwill with Clan Pestilence. Killing Thankwall in some gruesome manner before the eyes of Nurglich would certainly accomplish that. The Grey Seer's eyes narrowed, darting from side to side, looking for some route of escape. Nurglich wasn't the only member of the council who might welcome his death. Clan Moulder was among the more recent enemies he had unjustly acquired, blaming him for their own incompetence and inadequacy. Now Thankwall stood with a little ring of light, the exact center of the warpstone braziers. The smell of the smoke was intoxicating, almost euphoric. He could feel the fumes dulling his senses, clouding his wit. He tried to shake off the effect, trying to claw his way free of the pleasant sensation. He needed every speck of his brilliance and cunning if he was going to leave this chamber alive. However seductive, the numbing draw of the smoke was threatening his chances to escape this audience alive. "That is far enough, Grey Seer," a scornful voice wheezed from the darkness. Even this close, Thanquol could not see a shape upon any of the seats, nor pick out the chair from which the speaker spoke. The Grey Seer's fur stood on end, knowing the eerie absence to be a display of Night Lord Sleek's terrible skill. Through the fog of warpstone smoke, Thanquol could pick out other smells now. Faint, distant, but reeking of horror. He detected the faint tang of stagnant water and the thick musk of reptiles. He shifted his feet and felt the floor beneath him creak ever so slightly. Thanquol struggled to keep from brushing his teeth together in an overt display of terror. No Skaven in Skaven Blight had failed to hear the stories of the execution pit, the long, cold drop into an unclimbable well, its depths filled with the most horrid of Clan Moulder's creations, things, it was said, that swallowed their victims whole and alive, that left their prey breathing and screaming even as they were dissolved in their bellies. "You have failed the council, Grey Seer Thanquol," the grating voice of Critislick spoke. There was no room for question or argument in the tone, only accusation and condemnation. Thanquol abased himself upon the floor, grovelling against the symbol of the horned rat picked out upon the tiled mosaic in luminous green stones. "I was betrayed by my most worthless and cowardly minions," said Thanquol. "If they had only obeyed my plans." "Your plans?" snarled one of the voices. "Then you admit it was your strategy that cheated Clan Skyer of the airship." Thanquol shivered before the voice, distorted, almost featureless. The tones were drawn from a steel pipe instead of a living throat. The Grey Seer could easily suspect which of the Lords of Decay it was who spoke. Lord Morskitar, master of the Warlock Engineers of Clan Skyer. He could readily guess how eagerly the scientist sorcerers of the clan had been waiting to study the dwarf airship and learn its secrets. Such a weapon would have been a potent addition to the arsenal of the Under Empire, and a monstrous boost to the prestige and power of Clan Skyer. "Not here to whine about the past," a shrill, sharp voice interrupted. Thanquol tried to identify the voice, shuddering as he decided it might be that of Pack Lord Verminkin, overlord of Clan Moulder in its obscene science. "The failures of the past do not concern this council. It is the promise of the future that is our focus." A faint tremor of hope whispered through Thanquol's mind. He dared to lift his face from the floor. "How may this most unworthy one serve the great and mighty Council of 13, O ravenous despots," said Thanquol. "Still your tongue, and you shall hear," Verminkin snapped. Thanquol abased himself once more, and the Pack Lord continued. "It has been brought to the Council's attention that a potent artifact long thought lost has been discovered in our settlement of Under Altdorf. You will recover this artifact," the growling Paskrit and Nordwell continued. "You will recover it, and you will bring it back here to the Council of 13. "You will act as our agent," Critislick said. "You will have the full authority of this council behind you. The Council of Under Altdorf will submit to that authority in every way." Something came hurtling out the shadows, clattering against the flagstones near Thanquol's bowed head. The Grey Seer shifted his gaze, observing there was a thick black pendant upon which the symbol of the horned rat was picked out in crushed ruby. It was a talisman of the Lords of Decay, entrusted only to those they sent upon the most vital of missions. Suddenly the thrill of hope shriveled inside him. Anything vital to the council was also bound to be grotesquely dangerous, dangerous enough that none of the clans felt safe pursuing it on their own. If this wretched one might speak, Thanquol asked, lifting his head ever so slightly, careful to keep his lips over his fangs, lest anything he do be interpreted as a challenge. When no voice snarled from the shadows to silence him, the Grey Seer proceeded. Just one small question, O virile sires of storm vermin. This artifact which you would have this most unworthy of servants retrieve for you. Nurglich's oozing voice rose from the darkness. It is the Wormstone, the Plague Lord declared. Lost for 1,000 breedings in the collapsed burrows beneath the man nest of Altdorf, a potent weapon crafted by Clan Pestilens for the greater glory of the Horned Rat and the Skaven race. Stolen before it could be presented as a gift to the council. It didn't take a faint hint of Nurglich's putrid breath to smell his words, but Thanquol knew better than to challenge the lie. Skaven politics were built upon letting adversaries and rivals spew whatever inanity they liked, and pretending to accept it as something more than rubbish. If the council saw fit to accept Nurglich's story for the time being, Thanquol wasn't about to stick his own neck out. The Wormstone is a masterpiece of alchemical creation. This time it was the metallic voice of Morskitar that spoke. A block of pure warpstone endowed with new properties through a process now lost and forgotten. The Wormstone is the key to tearing down the decaying kingdoms of men and dwarves, said Nightlord Sneak. With it, we can unleash such plagues as the soft races have never imagined, even in their darkest nightmares. The statement ended with another peal of chittering laughter. Your colleague, Grey Seer Skarbrit, discovered the location of the Wormstone, said Kritislik. He was killed in the attempts to recover it, but his apprentice, Cratch, escaped to bring word of his find to us. You will succeed where Skarbrit failed, Grey Seer Thanquol. You will return to Under Altdorf with Cratch. You will recover the Wormstone, and you will bring it back. Thanquol nearly leapt out of his fur as a pair of armoured white storm vermin appeared silently beside him. One of the storm vermin held a tall wooden staff in its paw, a staff tipped with a bronze icon of the Horned Rat. The other held an ornate amulet, a solid piece of pure warpstone engraved with the symbol of Thanquol's god. The staff and amulet of the Horned One, the potent magic devices that had been confiscated from Thanquol upon his return to Skavenblight. The Grey Seer lashed his tail in delight just seeing them again. These too will accompany you, General Paskrit said. It took Thanquol a moment to understand that he meant the two storm vermin, not the objects they held. They will be another reminder to the leaders of Under Altdorf that you are representative of this council. Thanquol nodded his head in agreement, though he easily saw through the deception. The warriors wouldn't be simply protecting him, they would be the eyes and ears of the Lords of Decay, watching and waiting for any sign of treachery or duplicity on Thanquol's part. It was another example of how much importance they placed on the recovery of the Wormstone. I will leave at once, most grim and terrible of potentates, Thanquol said, abasing himself before the dais once more. He could hear a murmur of conversation in the shadows. One last thing, Kritislik said. Do not divulge anything of your mission to any within Under Altdorf. This council has been aware of a growing trend of independence and willfulness among the faithless tail-lickers of that city. Under no circumstance are they to be made aware of the Wormstone. Fail us in this, Thanquol, came the bubbling voice of Nurglich. At your most dreadful peril. Thanquol tried to keep a trace of dignity in his speedy withdrawal from the chamber as the black doors creaked open once more. After standing before the Lords of Decay, even the giant rat ogre in the corridor outside was a friendly sight. Kleiner was holding his sides, trying to push his ribs together, trying to squeeze out the pain. His insides felt as though they were on fire, as though little flickers of flame were dancing beneath his skin. The scratching had become maddening, his fingers were caked in blood, the coughing had become even worse, filth bubbling up from his throat that was too greasy to be blood and phlegm. After retiring from the Orc and Axe, Kleiner had withdrawn to his lodgings, an attic apartment in a rundown hovel overlooking the Imperial shipyards. He was certain he had become the victim of some ill humour he had been exposed to in the sewers. He could feel it gnawing at his body. Kleiner had seldom prayed to any of the gods, even Renald, the patron of thieves, but now he found himself begging Shalia, the goddess of mercy, to make the pain go away. If only she would show him that small grace, he would abandon his wicked ways. This time, he wouldn't let Hans talk him back into a life of crime either. Kleiner stuffed a rag into his mouth as another burst of violent coughing seized him. He couldn't let his landlady discover that he was sick. The best he could expect would to be thrown into the street. He could also imagine the paranoid old bat killing him in his sleep and dumping him in the Reich to keep any rumour of plague away from her boarding house. The big smuggler rose from the straw-covered pallet that served as his bed, kicking old bottles from his path as he hobbled across the dingy room. He picked a few stained rags from the floor, feeling his stomach churn as he saw ugly green worms slither away when he moved them. For hours now he'd been picking the loathsome things from his skin, dumping them in a copper slop bucket. Kleiner almost gagged at the smell rising from that bucket, and then dropped the bundle of rags into it. A vicious attack of coughing seized him, and the big man fell to his knees beside the reeking can. Lifting himself from the floor, Kleiner found the strength to carry the nauseating bucket to the tiny window that was the only ventilation in his room. He brushed aside the strip of canvas acting as a curtain. A blast of cold early morning struck him, and he blinked in the starlight. The city lay still and silent below. Summoning another reserve of strength, Kleiner dumped the bucket's content out the window. He watched as the rags and waste splashed into the gutter far below, then felt his gorge rise again. A pack of scrawny mongrels darted from the nearest alley, enthusiastically lapping up the filth he had cast below. Kleiner lurched away from the disquieting sight, letting the bucket drop to the floor. Another attack of coughing seized him. As he reached up to stifle the sound, he plucked something fat and squirming from his cheek. The worm resisted his effort to pull it free, its slimy dampness twisting away from his touch. The horror taxed the last reserves of the smuggler's strength. He tried to make it back to his pallet before his collapse. Kleiner didn't make it. The agonized scream echoed from the alleyway, ripping Theodore bare from his somber thoughts. Immediately the sergeant was dashing down the lonely, darkened street, two of his soldiers close behind him. It was simple circumstance that caused the men to be patrolling such a lonely stretch of street. Theodore had been hoping to locate members of Gustav Volk's gang out hunting for Hans Dietrich and his smugglers. When he heard the cry, his first reaction was to connect it to the brutal gang leader's vendetta. The scream, however, had not come from an adult. It was the shrill voice of a child. Rounding the darkened corner to run, trying to avoid the muck and garbage heaped in the gutters, Theodore saw that the victim of the outrage was no cocksure smuggler getting more than he bargained for, nor was the perpetrator some wolf-rat ruffian out for revenge. Instead, the watchman found a little girl, probably a bone picker or dung gatherer, judged by the smelly goatskin bag slung over her back. She was crouched in a corner trying to defend herself with a broken chair leg. Her attacker was a large, mangy dog, so thin Theodore could count every rib, its hackles raised and its jaws foaming. Theodore shouted at the cur, thinking to scare the maddened beast. The shout didn't frighten the monk. With lightning speed, the dog spun about, snapping and snarling at the would-be rescuers. That was when things took a strange turn. In the dim starlight, Theodore could see the dog's eyes glowing with a weird green luminance. The cur's tan pelt was thin and rubbed raw, but Theodore could see things moving across it like ripples in a river. It was with horror that the sergeant realized the effect of motion was caused by hundreds of wriggling worms burrowing up from beneath the dog's skin. The slavering mongrel did not wait for the watchmen to recover from their disgust. Snarling, it leapt at them, snapping its foam-flecked fangs at each of them in turn. One of the watchmen stabbed the animal with his sword, gouging a grisly wound in its flank. What bubbled up from the injury was too putrid to be called blood, and the men recoiled from the rancid stench. As the dog turned to focus on the man who had struck it, Theodore's own blade licked out, slashing it across the back, severing its spine. The brute flopped to the street, twitching, trying to pull itself upright with only its front paws. Even half paralyzed, the dog's instinct was to kill, its jaws snapping at Theodore as the sergeant moved towards it. Theodore's second blow finished the animal, a quick, sharp thrust through one of the weirdly glowing eyes and into the stricken mongrel's brain. A stench even fouler than before erupted from the dog as it slumped across the sergeant's steel. The soldier drew a kerchief from his tunic to wipe the blood from his sword, then cast the rag from him when he was finished. "Check the girl," Theodore told his men. The two soldiers had been staring in amazement at the gruesome carcass of the dog. Now they remembered the little girl whose screams had drawn them into an encounter with the strange beast. She was still pressed into the corner of the alley, seeming as though she was trying to push herself through the plaster wall. As the watchman came for her, in terror, the girl struck at them with the chair leg. One of the soldiers took a blow against his forearm, then relieved the child of the crude weapon. I don't think she's been bitten," one of the watchmen called to his sergeant after a cursory examination of the frightened waif. "Take her to the hospice, just to be sure," Theodore said. With something as unclean as the dog he had killed, it wouldn't do to take any chances. The gods only knew what evil might arise from even a small cut delivered by such a wretched beast. The Shallian sisters would know what to look for better than some overworked, underpaid Altdorf watchman. As the men carried the child away, Theodore lingered behind, continuing to study the gruesome cur. The worms weren't moving now. As the dog had died, they had grown still. At least most of them had. Several had dropped away from the body and wriggled away, burrowing into the muck of the gutters. Theodore knew there was some foulness beyond his understanding at work here. He knew this was more than just a matter of thieves and murderers. Just as he didn't know what to look for in the way of infection or injury on the little girl's body, he also accepted that he didn't know what to look for here. There was a connection, he was sure, between the horrible green worms here and the one he had seen in the Orc and Axe. The one he was certain had dropped off the smuggler's arm while he was scratching it. Something unclean, unholy, was at large in the waterfront. It would take a different sort of man to root it out and bring it to the ground. There was no pleasant way to do what Theodore knew he had to do next. When his men led away the little girl, they left behind her goatskin bag. Theodore walked over to it, upending it and spilling its contents of rubbish and rags onto the street. He needed it to carry a different kind of garbage. Using the chair leg, Theodore poked and prodded the carcass of the dog until it rolled into the open bag, tying the loathsome burden into a bundle, dragging it behind him. He made his way through the deserted streets. It wasn't the hospice or even the watch house that was his destination. He knew where he must take the wretched carcass. He knew where to take it if there were to be any chance of solving this strange enigma of the worms. Through the early morning chill, Theodore made his way, picking a circuitous path through back streets and alleyways. Peeling plaster walls gave way to splintered timber frames as his journey took him into the oldest, most neglected section of the district, a place so forgotten that it was ignored even by the lamplighters. He found himself trudging down muddy lanes surrounded by sagging structures that might have stood in the days when the city had still been called Reichdorf. Shingled eaves frowned down at him. Shuttered windows stared at him through lidded eyes. Somewhere a cat yowled and a night bird made its raucous call. Theodore felt his skin crawl, and a cold shiver ran up his back. However many times he followed the path, following the secret marks visible only to those who knew how to look, he could not shake the eerie impression that now gripped him. But this part of the city was more than simply forgotten. It was forsaken. It was forbidden. Theodore stopped outside a dilapidated storefront. A pane of frosted glass set into the timber wall bore gilded letters in antiquated script. Although Theodore could not make them out, there was no hint of the room behind the glass, so frosted with age and neglect was the window. Only those who had been inside could tell what the place housed. The curious would have been disappointed. Theodore was disappointed when he had first opened the heavy oak door set into the wall beside the window. He pulled an iron key from his belt and fitted it into the door's lock. There was a trick to working the key, a system of half-turns that had to be precisely worked to open the door. As it creaked inward on its hinges, Theodore found his nose filled with this musty smell of the building. The room beyond was just as it had been when he first laid eyes on it many years ago, empty save for a thick layer of dust upon the floor. Theodore dumped the goatskin bag and its grisly contents upon the floor, as he had done every time he visited the derelict building. He studied its walls, scrutinized the crumbling stairway that led up into the structure's upper levels. As he had found every time before, there was nothing to be seen. No hint of secret doors and hidden watchers, no clue to anything that suggested the place was more than an abandoned ruin on an abandoned street. It was more, however. Theodore retraced his steps and locked the door again behind him. Even if he had never been able to puzzle it out for himself, there was much more to the building than met the eye. Somehow, in some way, whatever was left in the room did not stay there. Somehow it would be retrieved, taken by the one man in Altdorf who would know how to unlock its secrets. The man Theodore Bayer called Master. Well, there you have it, guys. I hope you enjoyed that. Thank you so much for listening. It'd be great to hear from you in the comments below, and I am really looking forward to recording the next part myself. Take care, and I'll speak to you all again very soon.